I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
My name is Steve Malang. I'm senior editor at City Journal, and I'm here to introduce our final speaker of the day. You know, the New York Times once described Ed Glaeser as an economist who is not part of the, quote, tweedy, harumping, bad haircut tradition of academics. And I happen to notice, actually, Ed's got quite a marvelous haircut I did here today. Ed Glaeser grew up in Manhattan, but now lives in a suburb of Boston, which he arrived at by way of Princeton University and the University of Chicago's graduate program in economics. Now, rather than paying no attention to his work because he defected to a rival city in the American League East, the Manhattan Institute has thought it prudent to bring Glaeser back to New York now and then because he is, after all, the man whom Nobel Prize-winning economist Gary Becker said has revived the field of urban economics. Glaeser began fashioning his distinctive resume in urban economics at an early age with a study he co-authored in his mid-20s, which concluded that cities that wanted to thrive should seek a diverse mix of industries rather than focus on a single strength, a conclusion which is commonplace today but was startling at the time. Since then, Glaeser, a professor of economics at Harvard and head of the Kennedy School's Taubman Center for State and Local Government, has taken on some of the central issues facing cities and often upset conventional wisdom. He's argued and demonstrated through his research that the problem of housing affordability in many cities is not a function of too much demand, but of limitations on supply, often created by politicians and the regulations they craft. He's pointed out that one good indication of a region's success is the number of cars per capita, something that hasn't exactly endeared him to anti-sprawl advocates and promoters of mass transit. He's also traced the revival of some cities in the late 20th century to the skills of their populations, turning the notion of human capital into a central part of urban economics. Along the way, he's ruffled some feathers. After Hurricane Katrina, for instance, he argued that perhaps we shouldn't rebuild New Orleans, a city that had been declining for 150 years, but instead, we should invest in allowing the population to relocate and retrain itself. Although he considered that a supremely compassionate idea, focusing on people rather than place, not everyone took it that way. In City Journal, he's also said pretty much the same thing about Buffalo, which elicited hundreds of angry emails to the magazine from our neighbors to the north. He's also argued in City Journal that perhaps New York has something to learn when it comes to housing and zoning policy from Houston, of all places, and that the so-called green building and regulatory restrictions of many California cities are actually bad for the environment. In our new special issue of City Journal, New York's Tomorrow, the editors asked Glaeser, who is a contributing editor to City Journal as well as a Manhattan Institute senior fellow, to look at the challenges facing the city in the light of New York's ability to reinvent itself over the centuries. His analysis focuses on the strength of New York, not in finance or manufacturing or any one particular field, but in the overall quality of its people. The challenge will be to keep New York a magnet for talented people, even as the finance industry undergoes a sea change. That won't be easy because over the past 4 decades, Wall Street has provided the city with unprecedented resources which have allowed New York to invest in itself at a level that most other cities can only dream about. Now, as Ed says, New York's challenge is to deliver a decent quality of life at an affordable price at a time when, in a global economy, capital is mobile, especially human capital. New York's future, we know, lies with the quality of its people, including some who occasionally come down to Boston, from Boston, to help us find our way. It's a pleasure to welcome Ed Glaeser back to New York.
Thank you, Steve. That was enormously kind, and I always love being at Manhattan Institute and City Journal events. I can't tell you how much I feel at home here. And by that, I don't mean the Harvard Club. I mean the being around people who care so passionately about the city and believe in using rational thought as a means to actually improve the city. Now, my presentation is going to be considerably more upbeat than, say, EJ's presentation earlier, in part because I'm going to look at things from the perspective of the economy rather than the government. I mean, I certainly believe very strongly that the heart of New York City is the private entrepreneurs and independent workers who make its economy, make its society, make the whole city run, rather than, you know, our leaders in government. And things, I think, luckily look somewhat better from the private perspective than they do from the public perspective. Certainly, no one could deny that finance had become an enormously large enormously large part of the New York economy. In 2006, finance and insurance made up 40% of Manhattan's payroll. Securities and commodity contracts made up 28%. That's a very narrow sliver of industry, and yet it made up 28% of Manhattan's payroll. Obviously, a significant hit to these industries has enormous impact on the city, and we certainly shouldn't underpin that. On the other hand, of course, it's too much concentration in one industry isn't necessarily a good thing either. So there's certainly more than one bright lining in these recent events. This is what's happened to the unemployment rate over the last 30-odd years. The dotted line is New York City. The solid line is the United States. And unquestionably, we've had a very significant rise in the unemployment rate from 5 to the latest numbers for the city are 8.7%. One of the things, though, of course, that's interesting about this graph is that with the exception of a brief period in 1982 and then a brief period in the late 1980s, the New York number has generally been higher than the number for the U.S. as a whole. And that reflects, of course, the fact that New York has so often attracted people with less human capital because it provides the economic opportunity that it does. One of New York's enduring strengths is that it creates a place where people who start with less can do better, and that has been correlated with higher unemployment rates in the past. Of course, somewhat amazingly, despite the fact that the financial services sector was the locus of our current downturn, the city has in fact got a lower unemployment rate than the country does as a whole. This is housing prices, and again, the picture is one of a downturn, but again, one that's less severe than the country as a whole. In fact, New York, despite last month's numbers, which were not good, New York is still doing better than any of the other 20 Case-Shiller metro markets relative to 2000 in terms of its housing prices. Clearly, people are still betting on the city as we go forward. Now, from a broader historical perspective, this is certainly a shock, but New York's seen lots of shocks. New York has had a history that is not an unblemished road of eternal successes. We had a shock when the Dutch lost to the English. We had a shock at Leisler's Rebellion. We had a shock in 1783, which I'll come back to in a second, when the British left. We had a shock in 1863 when we were the site of the bloodiest riot in American history. We had a shock in 1907 during the financial crisis of that year, another shock in 1929. Heck, the whole 1970s, when I grew up in this city, felt like a shock from beginning to end. And of course, the popping of the 1987 crash was a pop. That was the crash that actually got me into academia instead of coming here to work on Wall Street. That was the year that I graduated, but that was certainly a shock. And of course, the popping of the internet bubble was a shock, and 9/11 was a shock. And yet, time after time, the city has proven remarkably resilient, remarkably able to reinvent itself. And certainly the case that I'm going to make is that reinvention has to do with the region's ability to attract extraordinary people who then exploit the core comparative advantages of this city, which is its density, its ability to connect people, and its access to the world. New York today, as it has been for 200, 300 years, has been the gateway between America and the world around us. And those things aren't going away. The ability of New York's density to make smart people even smarter because we learn from each other, that's not becoming less important. This recession is not changing the returns to being incredibly knowledgeable and the returns to being innovative. That will persist. And certainly, the recession is not going to change the growing trend towards a more globalized economy and a world in which other countries, China, India, are going to be increasingly important in the economy of the world. New York, because it is America's gateway, stands, I think, to play a larger role in the future rather than a smaller one. Let me just look briefly at one of these crises, 1783. So in the 18th century, New York had become the second largest city in the U.S., passing Boston around 1740. By following a Boston Triangle trade model. The basic problem, of course, of all the northeastern colonies was that we didn't really have any goods that people back in England wanted, at least not to the extent to which anyone was willing to pay for the very significant transportation costs of moving across the Atlantic. So smart merchants in Boston, who were fortuitously aided by the Barbados famine of 1648, figured out that you could work this triangle trade where we sold basic commodities south. That fed the people working in the cash crop colonies of the southern United States and the Caribbean, and then those cash crops went to Europe, and then Europe exported manufactured goods to us. New York played this role in the 18th century, and it played it better than Boston did, in part because the Hudson gave a great access to a rich hinterland that Boston's shallow Charles just didn't offer. And as someone who lives in New England farmland, I can tell you that farmland ain't so great either. But during the Revolutionary War, of course, New York was the capital for the British occupation force. And after the Revolution ended, the city's population dropped by 60%. So it had the largest population decline in percentage terms in the city's history. It just became a ghost town as the Tories fled. At the same point in time, being cut off from the British Empire meant a loss in access to the global markets that empire had been part of, or at least so it seemed at the time. So, for example, we were cut off from Havana Harbor in 1784. We could still trade in the British colonies, but not in New York ships. New York merchants could still trade, but they had to be in British ships. So things looked, I think, reasonably dire. Certainly much, the whole economic mechanism of the city seemed to be in question in 1784. And yet, by 1790, New York had risen to become, for the first time, the largest city in the colonies. The growth rate of New York City really hinged on a fulcrum then, that it went from having a growth rate of somewhere around 1.9% during the first 150 years of its history to exploding to a growth rate of over 4.4% between 1790 and 1860, whereas New York of 1784 was a city of 15,000 people. The New York of 1860 had almost 1 million people and had become the sort of recognizable urban colossus that it is to this day. There are lots of things which created this change, all of them related to smart people and to the geographic advantages that New York has. But in my City Journal piece, I point to two events of 1784, which are really the harbingers of what's about to come. What you're looking at here is a picture of the Empress of China leaving New York's harbor in 1784. This is the ship that opened up the China trade to Americans. It was the brainchild of a man called Daniel Parker, who was, seems to have been about half part genius and half part knave. And Parker had connected with a lot of New York merchants and with the redoubtable Robert Morris of Philadelphia, who was the leader of American finances during the Revolutionary War, as a supplier to the Continental Army. He had partners, one of whom is William Duer, who I'll get to in a second, but he put together this consortium to send out the ship. The great piece of genius in the ship was that he understood, he was able to figure out what the Chinese wanted and that America actually had a comparative advantage in producing it. And the miracle product of 1784 was ginseng, apparently in hot demand by relatively older Chinese gentlemen in the port of Canton for various purposes. Ginseng was, of course, good with an American advantage because Appalachia grows ginseng. And the price of ginseng in America was actually far lower than it was in European markets, giving America something of a comparative advantage in this. So a ship went east, filled with a combination of ginseng and furs and silver. And this ship, after a 12-month trip, proved the viability of this market. It wasn't, itself a great success, but it opened up this market. And it was part of the sort of long-distance seafaring travel that would be a crucial part of New York's success. The other signal event of 1784 was the founding of the Bank of New York. If there's one person who plays a central role in this, of course, it's Alexander Hamilton, a figure of much importance to MI. But Hamilton himself is both a symbol of two things that go on in New York City, one of which is just the genius of the immigrants who came to the city and made it great, right? This is a non-New Yorker attracted to New York, educated in New York, who just brought his extraordinary talents as an entrepreneur in both the private and public sectors. But he was also part of a tremendous network, right? He wouldn't have had his role in the Bank of New York without the patronage of Morris and Schuyler and other people who he become connected to, and connected because of New York City's density. The Bank of New York, of course, was, until very recently, the oldest firm being traded on the New York Stock Exchange. William Duer is actually the link between Hamilton and Parker. Parker himself had to flee America before the Empress of China returned. Apparently, he had borrowed more than he had and was sort of an early Bernie Madoff. But Duer was not, one of his partners is not exactly a model of propriety either. Duer had been secretary to the Financial Committee of the U.S. prior to the Constitution, and then served as the first assistant secretary of the Treasury. And there are a whole lot of nefarious doings that he was involved in terms of trying to extract bribes from different people. And of course, it's a given that these guys were trading on insider information, particularly buying up state securities before the announcement of the assumption of the state debt by the feds. I posted them that way because I want Hamilton looking disapprovingly at Duer on your graph. He did actually resign. Duer is, according to some histories, almost single-handedly responsible for the crash of 1792. He had moved on from playing a public role to being a speculator, and when he went down, he took a lot of New York with him. Again, though, this was another scene of reinvention. The crash of 1792 led directly to the Buttonwood Agreement, had very forceful response from Hamilton itself, and the city, barely registered this major financial crash in its long run history. Post 1784, post these events, New York really took off. And the starting point for New York's 19th century success was, of course, its rise as a port. The big event in the seafaring of the early 19th century was the move in the transatlantic commerce from a point-to-point system to a hub-and-spoke system. In the 18th century, relatively small ships made individual trips from Boston to Liverpool, from Baltimore to Glasgow. Over the early 19th century, the size of ships increased dramatically. So from an average of, say, 300-odd tons in the early 1820s to over 1,500 tons by, say, the early 1840s, something along that magnitude. As ship sizes increased, it became increasingly desirable to do what we now do for transatlantic flights, which is you have a hub-and-spoke system. So goods move over in the big ships and then get transferred into smaller coastal schooners. That hub and spoke proved absolutely critical in New York's rise. That New York's mild advantage as a port, which was obvious in 1790, when New York had a slight edge in Boston over its shipping, then got multiplied extraordinarily. Because if you're going to have a hub, New York was the natural hub. It was a central port, it had a deep harbor, it was relatively ice-free, both relative to Boston and relative to Philadelphia. It had much easier access to the Atlantic, and of course it had the Hudson cutting more than 310 miles into the American interior. All of these things made it the natural center. And as you moved from this point-to-point system, you had people like the great Jeremiah Thompson, one of the relatively forgotten innovators of New York in the teens and the 20s, starting the packet lines, the blackball packet line, which instituted regular cross-channel service for goods. He was a wool trader who, by the mid-1820s, was actually the largest individual debtor in the country, and he also managed to go spectacularly bankrupt in 1828. That's a fairly common theme, but the combination of taking great risks and then both achieving great things and going bust is a common theme in New York City history. During this period, this is the growth rate each decade from 1800 onward. What you see is in the 1800 to 1860 period, with the exception of the teens, you're averaging more than 50% growth every decade. I mean, the city was just doing absolutely extraordinary things. The one outlier later is 1900, which was, of course, the consolidation of the city. And this is a period in which the port is becoming dominant, but even more industry is locating around the port. And this is the basic logic of New York's 19th century growth, as an initial trading hub becomes a great center of commerce. The advantage, of course, of putting industry around the port is because transportation costs were so high in the 19th century. In 1816, it cost more to move goods 30 miles over land than it had to have them cross the Atlantic, right? Moving goods by water was just so much cheaper than moving them across the American hinterland. And because of this, if you're producing something, it made sense to produce it right in New York, where the people were, where the access to various waterways were. The three great American industries in the 19th century were sugar refining, which as late as 1820 was the highest value-added industry, the garment trade and printing and publishing. Many of you will remember this view from the east side over to Brooklyn. New York City's sugar had its start in the 18th century. Isaac Roosevelt, the founder of FDR's family fortune, was a sugar refiner down near Wall Street, and of course the Havemeyers were the great sugar refining dynasty of the 19th century. But sugar was naturally put in New York because if you tried to refine sugar crystals in the tropics, those sugar crystals coalesced on a long trip north. And if you tried to refine them at the point of consumption, you wouldn't exploit any of the economies of scale that are so evident in that large factory. So this huge value-added industry located in New York. The other two great industries were the garment trade. What you're looking at is the Lefcourt Marlborough building. A.E. Lefcourt has become a personal hero of mine, another guy who died bankrupt, but actually built more skyscrapers than any other New Yorker did during the first decades of this century. Also a person who started in the garment trade. He resolved the Great Riot of 1910 in collaboration with Louis Brandeis and Filene. And this is one of the buildings that he built. He started really creating the modern garment district and putting in sort of a new, more livable form of building for workers in this industry. The garment industry was naturally in New York because, of course, the fabric was coming through New York. The great commodity that was being shipped was textiles. So it was very natural to transform those textiles into New York. On top of that, you were supplying goods for sailors, as Brooks Brothers began in the 1820s doing. At the same time that Brooks Brothers was starting in that market, New York had chain dominance in printing and publishing, with a dominance that it would never lose. In the early 1820s, Carey and Lee of Philadelphia was the dominant American publisher, and it was in the 1820s that Harper Brothers managed to pass it. Why did New York become such a publishing powerhouse? Well, it really, again, has to do with the strength of the port. That Peveril of the Peak is a classic example. The big money in American publishing in the 19th century was publishing pirated English copies without any copyright payments. We have a lot to do. There's similarities between us and China today. Peveril of the Peak was was a great success for Harper Brothers because they got it on a Monday. They managed to print copies in 21 hours, and Carey and Lee in Philadelphia didn't get the book until Wednesday. Okay, the faster access to the books in New York gave publishing a leg up, particularly when the Harper Rule got in place, which said that the person who published first had rights, essentially property rights on the book. So you have this city, a city built on manufacturing, a city built around the port, around transportation like riverways and rails, and then the 20th century hits. And over the course of the 20th century, the real cost of moving a good a mile declined by more than 90% by rail. And even this is minor relative to the changes that happened in terms of trucking, in terms of the cars, the decentralized employment. Manufacturing first left cities and moved to suburban plants like Henry Ford's River Rouge plant, and then in fact left high-cost areas altogether. This is New York State's manufacturing relative to the U.S., going back to 1850. And you'll see back in the 19th century, almost 20% of the total manufacturing employment in the U.S. was going on in New York State. As of 1997, the last year I have there, it's less than 5%. None of this is surprising. None of it is necessarily bad, although it certainly created huge fiscal heartaches for the state. But manufacturing moved to lower-cost areas. The one-time advantage that New York had as this center of a transportation network, as a place where millions of immigrants were coming into the city, that really disappeared over time. And so we were left with this. This is the 1970s. I don't know if you can make out, that's Jimmy Carter in the South Bronx. One of my favorite images from my youth in the city. New York's decline wasn't unusual. Remember, 8 of the 10 largest cities in the U.S. have less population today than they did in 1950, right? Urban decline was the norm in the U.S. In fact, the surprising thing is that New York did as well as it did, not that it declined. And if you think about the roll call of those other cities like Cleveland and Detroit and Philadelphia, they don't exactly call out as being bastions of great success. And they were all hit by the same changes in transportation technology, very unfeasible cost structures for the public sector, lots of regulations. But the city ends up being, looking as if it's headed for the trash heap of history. It looks as if, time, not just Gerald Ford, is telling New York to drop dead. And yet, the city manages to reinvent itself. What you're looking at here is the trends in earnings per worker across cities. These are actually the central counties in each city from 1977 to 2002. And one of the things that you'll notice here is in the early period, these wages are very grouped together. They're all in constant $2,002. And New York is earning less than Wayne, Michigan. Okay, that's Detroit. So the Detroit auto workers are earning more per capita than the workers in Manhattan. So this is not actually residents of the city. This is actually people working in Manhattan. Of course, it looks nothing like that today. Wayne, Michigan has stayed relatively constant in real terms, and New York is far ahead of the pack right before other places that are centers of information and ideas, like San Francisco and Middlesex County, Massachusetts. But a massive increase, a real separation between places that looked very similar in the 1970s to places that looked very different up to in recent years. New York's urban reinvention is not something that's completely, unusual. It's something that has happened in other places. But New York is unusual in its size. And the basic thing that underpins all of these reinventions is that something that always existed in cities, the ability of smart people to learn from one another and create intellectual revolutions, that force which existed when Socrates and Plato interacted on an Athenian street corner and existed in the Florentine Renaissance when a chain of artistic brilliance went from, Brunelleschi, who figured out how to do perspective, to Donatello, who used it to create low-relief sculpture, to Masaccio, who put it on the wall of the Brancacci Chapel, to his student Fra Filippo Lippi. That chain, okay, which was something that happened in Renaissance Florence, but it wasn't the economic engine of Renaissance Florence. That was another wool town, another banking town, right? In the past 30 years, in the past 40 years, it was in fact a chain of brilliance in finance that actually became the engine of New York's economy. You assuredly know some of these people. You may not know all of them. I like to start the chain in the halls of the Social Science Building at the University of Chicago, and that's Jimmy Savage. Jimmy Savage is the guy with the bow tie up there. He was a co-author of Milton Friedman, who really worked out some of the earliest ideas about thinking systematically about trade-offs between risk and return. Next to him is Harry Markowitz, a young graduate student in the University of Chicago at that time, who acquired ideas about trade-offs between risk and return there and then moved west. The next picture is Jack Traynor, who was at Arthur D. Little and was one of the seminal figures bringing these ideas from the Academy for thinking more systematically about risk and return to Wall Street when he came to Merrill Lynch. Next to him is, of course, Fisher Black, who took over his portfolio at Arthur D. Little and was also one of the central human conduits between the Academy and Wall Street. The bottom row are, of course, all people who are quite famous, and they're, again, also a chain of people, all of whom used this knowledge and figured out new ways to riff on each other in ways that were practical. So Milken figures out how to use a better ability to think about trade-offs between risk and return to sell higher yield debt instruments. Henry Kravis then figures out how to use those higher yield debt instruments to then restructure corporate America. Lou Ranieri, along with Robert Dahl, is one of the fathers of mortgage-backed securities. And of course, there's our beloved mayor, who I highlight in the City Journal article as being a remarkable example of someone who's been laid off during a recession, who then turns remarkably entrepreneurial in 1982. And there are a couple of things about Mike Bloomberg that are really interesting in terms of his role as an entrepreneur. One of which, of course, is that he's part of this chain, right? His terminals provide the data services that this information revolution is all about. But he's also about the power of New York's diverse industrial structure to create innovation. So he's really drawing from two different industries. He's an IT entrepreneur in some ways, but he's not an IT entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. He's in New York, and he exploits the fact that he knows what traders want to be able to sell to the guys at Merrill Lynch terminals that actually fit their needs. That's information that no one sitting in splendid isolation in Palo Alto is going to know. Right? That's the same sort of knowledge that Jane Jacobs talked about when she talked about people from the dress industry coming up with figuring out how the brassiere should work in New York 100 years ago. It's the same sort of cross-industry spillovers that continue to be part of New York's magic. That diversity is one part of New York's success, but the running theme through all this is about skills and about talent. What you're looking at here is among the northeast and midwestern cities in the country, the difference in population growth rates is along the y-axis, and then you're just looking at the skills of the population, starting with, in 1970, starting with those cities with less than 7.5% of their adults with college degrees, up to those with between 15 and 31%. What you notice is there's a huge difference between skilled and unskilled cities. About 50% of the variation in urban success in these older, colder cities since 1970s can be explained by just the skilled proportion of the city as of 1970. Skilled places have managed to reinvent themselves. Less skilled places have not been able to. And I think the basic mechanism here is that the same Density, the same proximity that once made it possible to get hogsheads onto clipper ships, now enables smart people to exchange ideas. And that's exactly what this picture is supposed to be about. It's about smart people, all of whom knew each other, all of whom are figuring out new ways to make money. The connection between cities and skills also shows up in the next two graphs. What you're looking at here is the relationship between productivity and urban size in the most skilled metropolitan areas. So what you should notice is there's a very significant difference between smaller cities and big cities among highly skilled places. You know, if you're in a big city with lots of skilled workers, your GDP per capita goes up a lot. That's just not true. This is among less skilled metropolitan areas. The benefits of density, the benefits of size really disappear if you're looking at a less skilled metropolitan area. And you can see this in terms of Detroit versus New York City, right? Both big, dense cities, both places with lots of agglomeration. But New York has managed to reinvent itself while Detroit has not. And part of that is the skill difference. The other part of the difference is of course, the long-standing industrial structure of New York. 50 years ago, Ben Chinitz was comparing New York and Pittsburgh and arguing that New York had been able to be inventive, entrepreneurial over decades because it had a culture of entrepreneurship, by which he meant having lots of small independent firms. Pittsburgh, on the other hand, was dominated by a few large vertically integrated industries, the kiss of death for entrepreneurship. Right? The fact that you have firms that have, you know, their suppliers are all integrated. You can't open up a new firm and then get stuff working. It turns out Chinitz is dead right statistically. So what you're looking at the relationship is the number of average firm size across metropolitan areas in 1977 and employment growth since then. The places with small firms have just done a lot better than the places with large, monolithic firms. This, of course, leads me to wonder why in the world it's such a great idea to prop up GM, but I think that's a different topic. But New York's garment industry, of course, left it with this small firm industrial structure where people like A. Lefcourt were able to start with nothing and build themselves up fortunes. And I think that's really, you know, those combination of things, skills, diversity, and competition, are the things that really make New York great. And I think they're the reasons to continue to betting on New York. Looking forward, I tend to think that this crash looks nothing like the 70s. That in fact, in the 70s, you could really seriously doubt the long-term viability of New York City. This crash is an industry that bet too hard on certain bets. It's a natural swing. It's part of the sort of thing that we've seen for 250 years. Yes, it will be painful. Yes, it is painful right now. But it is not a basic challenge to what the city does. Because what the city does is to create new ideas. Right? What the city does today is it's a place in which smart people come from all over the world, and they become even smarter by hanging out with each other. Right? Human beings are a remarkably social species that learns enormously from each other. It's arguably mankind's greatest asset, is that we can actually interact with each other and become smarter as a result. Cities cater to that asset, particularly today, and as ideas, innovation, skills, human capital have become more important, cities like New York have become more important. That's not going to vanish. The returns to scale are not going to decline in no matter what happens to finance in the near future. And New York's going to be able to continue to take advantage of that. And it's going to continue to be able to take advantage of the fact that this agglomeration of skill is the conduit between the entire U.S. economy and the outside world. I would also say that it's foolish to count New York's finance out. Right? Yes, finance may never look the way that it did 12 months ago or 18 months ago, but you know, the world's going to continue to need financing. And New York's going to continue to have a comparative advantage in doing that. So I am far from sure that, you know, we should be thinking about, you know, financial services is gone. You know, it assuredly will be less than 28% of New York's payroll going forward, but I don't think that's so bad either, given the belief that I have that diversity is a strength. And again, competition is you know, the competition in the city continues to be intense in every walk of life. And whatever goes on in terms of city budgets or state budgets shouldn't leave us to forget that. But on the other hand, it is possible for us to blow this thing, and I'm hearkening back to Brian's words originally. I mean, I'm betting on the future of New York because I'm betting on the talented people, primarily private entrepreneurs, who make this city so special, and private entrepreneurs in every walk, you know, in the arts, in commerce, and in the public sector. But if you lose that talent, then you can be looking at a future like Detroit. Just because you're big doesn't mean that you're guaranteed success. It's all about keeping that talent. And as long as smart people remain here, I believe in their ability to reinvent the city, but those smart people may not remain here. Mayor Bloomberg has been dead on point in emphasizing the critical need in maintaining quality of life. That's a point that he's made repeatedly, and of course he's dead right. I mean, I certainly stand with Heather McDonald on the importance of policing, although I see the turnaround of New York as starting 20 years earlier than she does, and I see the private sector as playing more of a dominant role. But certainly policing and safety is absolutely crucial. But of course, so is the cost structure. Right, and Bloomberg has been less successful over the past 7 years, 8 years in terms of thinking about keeping costs down. And I think as we face the future, we have to recognize that human and physical capital is mobile, particularly human capital, that requires both good services, better schools, low crime, and also lower costs, less taxes, lower regulation. And all of that is, one of the many reasons why I'm so proud to be here as part of the MI family, and how much I believe in MI's long-term agenda of addressing these problems. So thank you.
We're going to take a few questions. We're going to take some questions, but we do have microphones roaming around. Deborah, if you could just identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Eamon Moynihan. You talk about the returns to education on a metropolitan level. Does that apply on a state level or statewide level? You think of New York, which has a huge state university system, much of it upstate. New England has a great university system, population's been very flat. Is this more of an urban phenomenon, or does it apply to states?
Look, I mean, one of the things we know is that skills matter at every level, unquestionably, and they matter enormously at the country level. In part because there are political consequences of skills. If you look across states in the U.S., you find that the most educated states have the least corruption, for example, and the least educated places have the most political problems. Think Louisiana and Mississippi, which perpetually lead the corruption measures. So unquestionably, education is good everywhere. That doesn't mean that education is always worth the cost, right? I mean, that's saying that there are benefits and that they're substantial, but obviously it also costs money. But I do think there is something very special about the connection between cities and education, and cities and human capital, in part because they do the same things, right? Universities are tools for bringing smart people together and allowing them to learn from one another. Mostly students learn from other students. Occasionally, we professors have some modest impact, but that's certainly the main impact of what universities do. And cities do the same thing. Right, cities are basically, the key value added today of cities is connecting smart people and enabling them to learn from one another. And the more that they know before they show up in a dense urban area, the more that that density becomes valuable. So there is a special connection between urban density and skills, but skills are valuable on every level, unquestionably.
Other questions? Yes, Michael. Deborah's going to go.
Michael Myers, I take it your optimism is based on a prediction that there will not be another 9/11. Because if there is another 9/11, I think not only do we have a brain drain, you will have people who flee in the city. Now, with respect to the brain trust, the smart people, I always understood that young smart people can't get into New York because they can't afford it in terms of housing and stuff like that. And if the young and older smart people do leave New York, where do they go?
There are really two parts of this comment. One of which is the 9/11 comment, and certainly if New York becomes too dangerous, whether because of street level crime or because of international terrorism, that is unquestionably a threat to the city. I think the relative paucity of terrorist attacks in the city since 9/11 has caused that fear to recede slightly, but perhaps that we should continue to be ever vigilant on that. On the issue of the affordability of New York, and this is something that I've been proud to do with MI, is to do my work on land use regulations. I believe very strongly that housing affordability in New York is a major problem. It continues to be a major problem, less so than it was a year ago, and that's certainly the flip side of declining housing prices. That's one of the reasons why I was so hostile to the idea of the government stepping in to try and artificially inflate housing prices. That one person's capital loss on their house is another person's increased affordability. I certainly believe that New York needs more housing that can be affordable. I believe that comes primarily, overwhelmingly, from private sector development. I think that there's very little to be gained by large public initiatives in this area, but that instead eliminating the fetters that stop the private market from delivering houses is incredibly important. I mean, if we think back to the early 20s, to the era of A.E. Lefcourt, builders were creating 100,000 units a year in New York City. A lot of them, like Lefcourt, went broke as a result. But that's okay. That's not the huge problem. They provided a whole lot of housing in the city, many of which people in this room, including myself, have lived in. And that was about making New York more accessible, more affordable. Certainly, as we think forward, creating more housing in New York is absolutely critical for the city being inclusive and for not being a boutique city. As fond as there was a comment that was mentioned earlier about my work on diversity and competition, which harkens strongly back to the work of Jane Jacobs, who got this entirely right. On the other hand, I think Jane Jacobs was wrong about height in New York. I mean, Jane Jacobs had this odd belief that you got great stuff once you got to Greenwich Village level densities, but once you got beyond that, it's all over. It's dead. And this is very clearly in Death and Life of American Cities, and I think she's just wrong. As someone who grew up in a New York City block that was considerably denser than that, I certainly felt the magic of New York as a kid growing up in that. And if you don't build up, it's not, as Jane Jacobs thought, that the city becomes more affordable. This was sort of a very convoluted economic logic, that if you keep old housing, you make things cheap. This was sort of Jane Jacobs' logic. This is nonsense. This is not how economics work. If you restrict supply facing sharp rise in demand, you make things unaffordable. So the only way to counter that is by building. And the only way within its crowded island of Manhattan to build is to build up and to eliminate the rules that have for too long restricted stuff. I also just, as we're talking about attracting talent, I think, I probably have not paid enough attention. I was talking to Mitchell Moss earlier, either in the article or in my presentation about the incredible importance of immigrants. Right? It's those immigrants who help make New York a gateway, a conduit to the outside world. And cities just as they have a comparative advantage in connecting skilled people and creating innovations, they also have a comparative advantage in easing the flow of immigrants into this country. I mean, New York has been a place with a comparative advantage in this for centuries. And both the fact that you can survive without a car for every adult, right, and the fact that you have longstanding ethnic networks, some sort of social safety net, all of those things mean that New York has done well for immigrants, and immigrants have done very, very well for New York. And I think as we look forward in the future, right, you want to think about two models of density. One of which is an inclusive New York model, built at high densities, built in a way that can welcome people from all over the globe easily, and the other of which is a very exclusive model of density, which is Silicon Valley. Also, a tremendous combination of smart people who you can tell the same story about smart people riffing on each other with the Fairchild. The fair children and their innovations. But that's a model that is entirely based around the car, even stronger limits on building, extraordinarily high housing prices, where poor people need not apply. And I think that's something that New York should take pride in. And I think the fact that New York continues to be such a magnet for people who start with less is one of the greatest things about this city.
Other questions? Anyone else? I have one for you.
Steve.
One of New York City's challenges is that it happens to be, for lack of a better word, a cash cow for the state. Other great cities are sometimes in the same position. Do cities that are innovative and inventive and resource producing sometimes find themselves dragged down by larger political entities? And how do you deal with that particular issue?
New York is pie for the hayseeds. Plunkett said it, and he was probably right. I can't help thinking of the far worse situation that's faced by the great growing cities of India today. So, however problematic you think Albany is, imagine being ruled by, the government of Maharashtra, right? Overwhelmingly rural, overwhelmingly poor, and you've got a bunch of guys who are building one of the world's great cities in Mumbai or in Bangalore, and they face, unbelievable political hurdles to do anything. Right, the state government controls everything, and it couldn't care less about their objectives. And I think this is something that helps explain why Indian cities are so lacking in infrastructure and so lacking in regulations that would make sense. However problematic you think the zoning code of 1961 is, take a look at Mumbai's, right, which is perhaps the worst zoning code in the entire world. Right, the state control certainly has something to do with that. I continue to think that it's odd that America is moving towards more federal leadership, a larger share of federal funding for local projects, a dominant state sector, when in fact city governments are looking better than ever. Whereas, the federal government doesn't look so great, but we're moving, which would have thought that moving towards more devolved authority would make sense, but we're clearly moving in the opposite direction. So my heart is with those who think that New York needs more power to control its destiny, but I'm not sure that we should be betting on that anytime soon.
We have
Henry. I must say, there are a few things that I enjoy, Henry, as much as your weekly reports on New York that make me feel like I'm back here at a regular interval.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that. My question, as you might imagine, is about the role of government. New York, over the last hundreds of years, has had good mayors and bad mayors. It had crooks, thieves, out-and-out thieves. It's had people like LaGuardia. It's had eccentrics of various types. What do you think is the role of government in the ebb and flow of the city? Or do you think it really doesn't make that much difference, that these are systemic changes which just take place?
Look, I don't think a little bit of theft is critical one way or the other. I think there've been plenty of good urban leaders who have been crooks. That's not an issue. But I do stand with with Heather McDonald and with those who believe that if the city fails to deliver the basic quality of life issues, it can be enormously costly. And those things are not things that the private market necessarily takes care of. You could certainly imagine going towards more of a private sector solution in education, and I would certainly support that. But right now, at least education is within the province of the public sector, and it's incredibly important for the future of the city. It's hard to think of a greater curse that could have been placed on great cities like New York than this bizarre thing that you have to leave New York City's boundaries to get public schools that you want, right? I mean, it's an enormous curse that America's system places on New York, which could be solved either by moving to a Friedmanite solution of having vouchers which could be taken anywhere, or heck, towards a French monolithic solution, which of course I'm not advocating, but a system that in fact had uniform high quality education done at the national level would also eliminate this huge curse that New York regularly struggles against. Congestion in roads, another huge issue that a city like Mumbai or Bangalore can curse themselves by having such awful road policy. Boy, if there's ever been a need for congestion pricing, it's when you see a bullock in front of you on a major urban highway. It's slowing down everything. And of course, above all, people need to be safe in their property and their person. And this is a job for government. Actually, above that, there's clean water. Right, above that, even above crime and safety, right? Getting rid of your clean water is a sure way to make sure that your city will die both immediately and in the long run. And again, this is the kind of thing that New York City solved in the 19th century, often with the participation of plenty of crooks. But building the Croton Aqueduct and creating a viable water system for the city was in fact hugely important. So I don't want to minimize the role of government, for goodness sakes. But I do have a vision that the role of government in the long run is to create favorable conditions that attract smart people, and then to basically get out of their way. So particularly at the local level, governments do incredibly important things, the things that MI and City Journal have written about extensively, but that is not actually micromanaging innovation. That, in fact, that is something that is not well done, and then ultimately it's those innovators who will be the engines of economic success.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.